January 30th, 1944. Beachhead of Anzio, Italy. General Alfred Schlemm, commander of German forces in the region, commented that no field guns could reach our reinforced positions. The comment was recorded in his trading log that morning. Hours later, a single shot would erase an entire bunker, built to the standards of Reich fortified engineering, as if it were made of paper. Schlemm's confidence, like that of so many other commanders, was about to be buried next to the concrete wreckage they so believed invulnerable. This is the story of a quiet turnaround. Not a big battle, not an offensive of millions of men, but the introduction of a precision weapon, the American 240mm Howitzer, turned German defensive doctrine into ruin. With each shot, a bunker disappeared. With each bunker, a belief fell. And what the Germans called a fortress, the Americans began to call a target. In this video, we will reveal how the United States won a concrete war with mathematics, production, and logistics, and how the sound of this howitzer became, for the Germans, the sound of the end. But before we dive into the data, there is a statistic that defines this story in a cruel and indisputable way. Between 1944 and 1945, the United States fired 118,429 240mm shells at German positions. Of those, 3,147 were directed at reinforced concrete bunkers, and 3,114 were completely destroyed. On average, 38 shots were enough to erase a fortification designed to withstand months of siege, a weapon that didn't need to see the enemy to hit them, a logistics that the Germans did not know how to respond to, and a terror that traveled in a parabolic trajectory until it turned shelter into a trap. If you value the story told accurately, and believe that numbers like these deserve to be remembered, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps us to continue digging up the facts that memory cannot erase. Anzio, Italy. The morning of January 30th, 1944, began with silence and fog. Inside the Louisa command bunker, German Major Hedman Vera Hoffmann was finalizing a routine report. In the spreadsheets, there was trust. The structures were positioned according to Reich fortification manuals. The concrete had been tested to withstand direct impacts of up to 210 millimeters. It was considered enough. However, at 2:32 p.m., the theory collapsed. A single American 240mm shell struck the center of the structure with absolute accuracy. What was once a bunker has disappeared into a crater covered in smoke and dust. There was no warning. There was no repetition. 4 meters of reinforced concrete collapsed under the invisible force of a howitzer, fired from a position out of visual range. 32 soldiers of the Grenadier Panzer Division were buried. Major Hoffmann survived by having gone to get coffee 5 minutes earlier. He would write down in his diary later that night, the sound was not that of an explosion. It was a sentence. What the Germans called invulnerability began to crumble there. The weapon responsible was the M1 240mm, an American super-heavy howitzer that debuted in combat that day, operated by the 697th Field Artillery Battalion. Few understood at the time, but that solitary impact was a test, and the result was clear. All the defensive premises of German fortified doctrine were outdated. What seemed impregnable could be destroyed with surgical precision. But the real astonishment was not in the shot. It was in the rhythm. This was just one of 847 fortifications that would be engaged by the 240mm howitzers over the course of the European campaign. Of these, 3,114 were completely destroyed. In Anzio, the howitzers operated for only 4 days. In that period, 67 bunkers were targeted. 61 of them ceased to exist. The average number of shots per bunker was 4.8. These were not saturation bombardments, but punctual, mathematical, repeatable attacks. Artillery, hitherto associated with brute force, now operated with scalpel logic. What's more, this entire operation was carried out with mobile weapons, towed by standardized vehicles, transported in logistics convoys already tested in North Africa. Production was industrial, maintenance routine, the doctrine replicable. The Germans were unaware that the Watervliet arsenal in New York had reached the mark of 13 guns produced per month as early as 1944, each capable of replicating what Major Hoffmann witnessed at Anzio. And it wasn't just the cannon. Each shot required a supply chain capable of delivering forged 360-pound projectiles with a tolerance of 0.01 inches, transported by heavy-duty trucks, with fuel, spare parts, cranes, and high-precision ammunition. The strike force wasn't in the field, it was in the factory, and the detail that the Germans ignored was this: America did not only produce weapons, it produced the ability to continue producing. American production of ammunition for the 240mm Howitzers reached 10,000 shells per month in early 1945. By way of comparison, the entire German production of heavy ammunition for equivalent weapons did not exceed 1/200 units in the same period. If this statistic surprised you, comment "Logistics wins" below. It defines the real battlefield of World War II. In Anzio, the impact was just the beginning. When the German reports reached Berlin, few believed the numbers. A ground weapon cannot destroy a 4-meter fortification with a single shot, read an internal Wehrmacht note. The American response came weeks later, in the hills of Monte Cassino, and this time, the fortress was a medieval monastery, converted into a stronghold. The bunkers were carved into the mountain, the shielding enlarged, and confidence restored. But it wouldn't last, because the 240mm Howitzers were approaching, and this time, they would not come alone. In 1940, as Germany celebrated the invincibility of its fortifications and perfected the defensive architecture that would shape the Siegfried Line, the United States faced a quiet, practical dilemma. Studies by the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department showed that none of its field armaments were capable of reliably neutralizing a modern European bunker. The standard 155mm gun, inherited from the First World War, had limited impact against reinforced concrete more than 2 meters thick. The realization was straightforward. If Americans wanted to break through the Reich's defenses, they would need a weapon that did not yet exist, something large enough to pulverize steel and concrete, but mobile enough to be transported quickly through continental theaters. Instead of following the logic of the railway superguns, heavy, slow, and logistically vulnerable, the Department of Artillery opted for a radically different path: to develop a super-heavy but towable howitzer. The decision would mark the birth of the M1 240mm, the largest mobile howitzer ever produced at scale by U.S. industry. The technical specification required it to fire a 360-pound projectile with a range of more than 23,000 meters and with penetrating power of up to 6 feet of reinforced concrete. Each piece, once assembled, weighed 29 tons and required recoil pit digging, dedicated M2 crane, and a crew of 14 men. At first glance, it seemed impractical, but for the Watervliet Arsenal, founded in 1813 and already operating in 3 shifts, the difficulty was only one variable of production. By November 1942, the first 6 prototypes were ready. By 1943, production was accelerating, and at the beginning of 1944, the system was already integrated into field battalions with their own doctrine. The howitzer wasn't just an artillery piece, it was the heart of a complete system: logistics, transportation, assembly, operation, shot correction, and maintenance. The irony, for the Germans, began here. While their engineers bet on wonderful weapons, such as the 800mm Gustav, with unique rails and a rate of fire every 45 minutes, the Americans delivered mobility with similar destructive force and standardized logistics. Instead of 6 monumental guns, they built 315. And they didn't need armored railroads to operate them. All it took was a reasonable road and a few hours. On the field, the process was methodical. The gun arrived disassembled, with the barrel in a 6-wheeled trailer and the retreat car in another. The crane was positioned, excavation began, and in less than 8 hours the howitzer was ready to open fire. On the front line, forward observers guided the firing with SCR 610 radios, passing the coordinates to the center of fire direction, where meteorological calculations, distance, slope, and ballistic corrections defined the solution. The response was quick: 4 minutes between the request for a shot and the impact. No army in the world had anything comparable in accuracy and response time, let alone scale. And the secret was in philosophy. The Germans built fortifications as symbols. The Americans treated them as problems. The mathematics of terror began with the shot but was drawn in the factory. For each tube of the M1, 65 tons of special steel were required, 847 machining, heat treatment, polishing, and proof firing operations. The rejection was less than 1%. For each round, 49 pounds of Class A TNT, individual casting, balancing, machined rotary bands, delayed fuse installation, and final inspection. When the projectile reached its target, penetration was followed by internal detonation, generating an explosion of more than 200,000 psi inside the structure, breaking the concrete from the inside out with sympathetic fractures. The impact wasn't just structural, it was moral. What the Germans called fortress, the Americans began to call a point, and what should have resisted for weeks lasted seconds. When the first reports reached the Wehrmacht commands, the reaction was disbelief. But the frequency of the results began to belie the certainties. The average recorded in the post-battle reports: 1 bunker destroyed for every 38 shots. On the field, the number was even more cruel. Sometimes, a single impact solved it. Of the 847 bunkers targeted by the 240mm Howitzers, 114 were simply erased from the map with absolute accuracy, and the rest offered no resistance after 2 or 3 hits. The doctrine of permanent fortification, the direct heir of the First World War and the pride of German engineering, began to crumble. Because the enemy did not attack with masses of men, nor with cavalry or assault tanks. He attacked with calculations, and with the certainty that it could repeat the destruction on an industrial scale without logistical exhaustion. The irony was total. The army that relied most on engineering was defeated by superior engineering, but applied to production. The arsenal of democracy, as Eisenhower would later define it, was just beginning to show its reach. Because if a bunker was just a calculation, then all West German defenses were, in fact, numbered. And this, the German generals would realize too late. In April 1944, an artillery officer of the 14th Panzer Corps wrote, "Our men no longer have faith in concrete. Many refuse to occupy new fortifications. Faith disintegrated with sound." But in the heart of Italy, the Germans still believed that the fortified monasteries on the slopes of Monte Cassino would endure. They were unaware that 8 new 240mm Howitzers were being positioned in the valley, and this time, the targets were hidden in the rock. Monte Cassino, February 1944. The Benedictine Abbey, founded in the year 529, watched from the top of the rock the valley occupied by the Allied forces. For the German command, this millennia-old structure was not just a religious symbol, it was a natural military stronghold. The defenses were buried in the hillsides, connected by tunnels, protected by reinforced concrete, and meticulously integrated into the geography. Wehrmacht officials assured that no conventional artillery could dislodge the units of the 1st Parachute Division entrenched there. When the first 240mm projectile hit one of the hidden galleries, American advanced observers reported a simple visual effect. The slope shook, followed by a column of smoke and stones. But inside the position, the impact was absolute. 3 compartments collapsed. 11 soldiers died with no chance of evacuation. The sound, survivors said, sounded like earth being torn apart. There was no warning. There was no confrontation. Just one accurate shot, coming from more than 23 kilometers away. The 45th Fortification Engineering Regiment, responsible for designing Cassino's defenses, had calculated resistances against direct explosives, 155mm impacts, and even tactical aviation. But they had not foreseen the penetration curve of the 240mm howitzer, a long, silent, and lethal parabola. The projectile hit from above, where the cover was thinner, penetrated the ground and exploded under the foundations. Each shot eliminated a position that had taken weeks to build. The logic of time was reversed. What took 90 days to erect disappeared in 9 seconds. The psychological effect was immediate. Groups of German paratroopers began to move positions between shots, sleeping outside the bunkers and avoiding staying for long periods in shelters. The fear did not come from the intensity of the explosion, but from the absence of a pattern. The enemy knew where to hit, and it hit without hesitation. The system that made this possible was not just in the howitzer, it was in the eyes and in the calculations. Each shot of the M1 was preceded by a chain of decisions operated in real time. Forward observers, soldiers with M17 binoculars, SCR 610 radios, and topographic maps, collected coordinates and transmitted them to the center of fire direction. There, field meteorologists corrected the wind vector, technicians adjusted the propellant load, and the firing team received the final command. The average time between detection and impact was 3 to 5 minutes. For the Germans, this was impossible. No Earth system had demonstrated such speed with such precision. At Cassino, the 240mm fired 318 times in 8 days. 46 positions were hit. 39 were rendered unusable. Of these, 22 did not present subsequent resistance. A German major wrote, "It's as if they see inside the mountain." But the vision came from doctrine. The American ability to integrate communication, topography, ballistics, and logistical standardization allowed for a rate of fire with artificial intelligence from the analog era. It wasn't luck, it was method, and behind it, there was production. Each 240mm system operated with 14 men, 2 cranes, 6 trucks, and a stock of 200 rounds of ammunition. The assembly in the field took 8 hours. Disassembly, 4. All this under enemy fire. But the jail worked, because it had been tested, trained, and above all sustained by an industrial machine that did not stop. The Watervliet arsenal operated 24 hours a day. The workers received bonuses for zero tolerance and knew that each inaccuracy could cost lives. The barrel of the M1 went through 19 machining phases and 3 internal polishing phases. Each tube was fired in a test with 10 charges before release. The average rejection was 1.6%, and this included thread tolerances, rail alignment, ejection, and indentation. The enemy, however, did not see the factory. I saw only the effect. In Cassino, the sound of the 240mm came to be recognized by its range, the slow hiss, the detonation dries up, and soon after, the collapse of stone and steel. Defensive engineering was demoralized by offensive engineering. The doctrine that predicted resisting conventional artillery was superseded by artillery that no longer fit the concept of conventional. German superiority, based on fixing positions and controlling high ground, was destroyed by a weapon that did not contest position, only coordinates. In March, the Allied commanders decided to preserve the central abbey by avoiding attacking it directly, but their defenses around them were eliminated one by one. When the New Zealanders and Poles advanced through the ruins, they found demoralized soldiers, abandoned fortifications, buried tunnels. The mountain had not been taken. It had been dismantled. Officially, the offensive in Cassino cost weeks of battle and thousands of lives, but the Allied internal reports record, the most difficult positions collapsed when the 240mm came into action. A German general after the war stated anonymously, "We were afraid to look through the periscope. We didn't know if we would see the enemy, or death coming in a parable." And while the Italian front was crumbling, in France, American engineers were preparing something even bigger, a ground offensive with more than 100 240mm howitzers positioned between the Allied lines. And the first target would be the most feared fortification in Western Europe, the Siegfried Line. In 1940, even before the first shot was fired in the Italian campaign, a quiet meeting in the Ordnance Department of the United States Army decreed the beginning of a war that had not yet come. The engineers had received detailed reports of the Maginot Line, the Siegfried, and new expanding German fortifications. The conclusion was straightforward, almost cynical. No existing American field armament was capable of reliably penetrating more than 6 feet of reinforced concrete. The 155mm was not enough. The 203mm was inaccurate and limited. The solution was clear and, at first glance, absurd. It would be necessary to create a howitzer that fired nearly 170-kilogram projectiles, with enough speed to break through 6 feet of concrete and accuracy capable of reaching a fixed point more than 23 kilometers away. But it was not enough to be powerful. It needed to be mobile. Railroad was unfeasible. The German Gustav-type guns required weeks of assembly, dedicated rails, air cover. The future would be towable. Thus was born the design of the M1 240mm, the largest mobile field howitzer in American history. The Watervliet Arsenal in New York was given the mission to develop the barrel. The technical specification called for thermal resistance greater than 2700 RTF, internal treatment with industrial chromium, and machining tolerance of less than 0.003 of an inch. The process began with blocks of nickel-plated steel forged at 1200 OC, then shaped and ground in 19 stages. The end barrel weighed more than 5 tons. Logistics, however, was the real weapon. Each M1 was transported on 2 M2 trailers. one for the pipe, one for the recoil car, and operated with 20-ton cranes for assembly in the field. It took 6 to 8 hours to be assembled by a trained team, but once positioned, it could fire at a rate of 1 shot every 2 minutes. The preparation of each shot involved 5 operational sections: transport, assembly, fire direction center, part operation, and maintenance coordination. All of this was standardized, trained, and sustained by an industry that operated in 3 shifts. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. While the Germans invested in railway supercannons with brutal destructive power but unfeasible on the modern battlefield, the Americans gambled on a weapon that looked less impressive, but was producible, operable, transportable, and above all, replicable. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts with the accuracy that history demands, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to reveal the forgotten details that decided the war. Because in this case, victory was born on drawing boards, not in trenches. In April 1942, the first prototype of the M1 was successfully fired. Penetration was complete. 6 obliterated concrete feet, crumbled steel core, inverted cone-shaped damage pattern, ideal for collapsing underground casemates. The following year, the Army ordered 3 I-15 units. Watervliet's arsenal tuned production with precision machining on parallel lines, while shell factories in Indiana and Illinois manufactured timed fuse, contact fuse, and delayed fuse, each calibrated for specific attack situations. The impossible weapon had become a functional cog. When the first models arrived in Africa for final trials, the Allied command knew they were about to change the battlefield. And when the first impact was recorded at Anzio, the effect wasn't just destructive, it was doctrinal. The Germans still relied on concrete and angle of fire. Americans relied on calculation, repetition, and logistics. And as production progressed, more battalions received the M1 as a standard campaign piece. By 1944, 6 battalions were fully equipped, each with 12 pieces. There were 72 weapons capable of crossing a fortification off the map with precision. But not even the Allied generals imagined the true effect this would have on the battlefronts. Because destroying a bunker was just the beginning. What would come next was the collapse of a belief. And it would all begin with a symbolic fortification, a defensive line of 630 kilometers of concrete, steel, and doctrinal optimism. The next stop would be the Sigfrido Line. In September 1944, on the banks of the Moselle River near Metz, a group of German soldiers were watching the horizon with long-range binoculars. On the other side of the line, no infantry advances, no tank roars, no saturation bombardment, just silence. At 7:43 a.m., that silence was broken by a sudden, dry impact. A bunker of the B-Work series, 3 meters thick and capable of withstanding direct impacts of 210 mm, disappeared in a single explosion. The roof was torn off. The foundations imploded. No gun salute, no repetition, just one shot. It was at this point that German officers began to realize that the American threat lay not just in brute force, but in something more frightening: accuracy. The 1-inch M240mm howitzer was not an area bombing piece. He didn't seek to destroy everything. He sought to destroy something specific, with surgical efficiency. The secret behind this was an integrated and rational system, far beyond conventional artillery. It all started with the forward observers, positioned on high ground, forests, or even abandoned civilian towers. Equipped with M17 binoculars, 125,000 scale topographic maps, and SCR 610 radios, these soldiers were the eyes of the artillery. The mission was simple: locate the target, visually confirm the position, map the coordinates, and transmit them accurately to the Fire Direction Center, the so-called Fire Direction Center, FDC. There, military mathematicians, many of them civil engineers recruited from industry, analyzed the information received, adjusting the data according to wind speed, humidity, temperature, and slope of the terrain. Each shot was treated as an equation: the angle of elevation, the weight of the projectile, the type of primer, the flight time. Everything was calculated before the first shot was authorized. And then, the howitzer operated. With a margin of error of less than 10 meters at distances greater than 20 kilometers, the M1 became more than a weapon. It was a ballistic scalpel. An identified bunker was, in effect, a condemned bunker. This degree of accuracy was only possible because the American gunnery doctrine had abandoned the flurry philosophy. Unlike the Soviets, who used massive barrages, or the Germans, who prioritized concentrations of fire in a less integrated way, the United States had developed a centralized firing system in which each shot was part of a collective decision. The tactical command defined the target, the observers adjusted the aim in real time, and the FDC validated the calculations. In the field, the pieces received coded instructions, adjusted their manual aiming systems, and the impact happened. The interval between target identification and explosion was, on average, 3 to 5 minutes. In many cases, the first shot already hit the vital point of the structure. The moral effect of this was devastating. In interrogations conducted by the U.S. Army, captured German soldiers reported that there was no longer a safe zone inside the fortifications. It was as if they knew exactly where to aim, said a sergeant in the 19th Volksgrenadier Division. And they knew, because the differential was not just the caliber, it was the system. The set of doctrine, observation, calculation, and shooting functioned as a living organism, and was replicable on any front. By the time the 240mm Howitzers arrived on the Western Front in October 1944, integrated into the divisions approaching the Siegfried Line, the system was fully operational. With each infantry advance, the FDC moved with them, connected by radio networks and optimized logistical routes. A new bunker was no surprise. It was just a new coordinate to be processed. The myth of brute force has given way to systematized precision, and the effects were coldly calculated. Conical craters, internal structural collapses, targeted quakes. In some cases, it was not even necessary to destroy the bunker. It was enough to block its entrance, bury its exits, or blow up its ventilation system. War is no longer a direct confrontation and has become reverse engineering. And all of this was underpinned by a supply chain with redundancy. Each artillery battalion operating M1s had an autonomous stock of spare parts, mobile workshops, specialized mechanics, and safe ammunition supply routes. If one piece broke, another took over. If the terrain was difficult, the crane was repositioned. If the weather changed, the calculations were redone. And most importantly, the system did not stop. The American differential was this: the machine never crashed. Production, doctrine, and the field were synchronized. The weapon that seemed excessive, 240mm, was, in fact, the visible face of an ecosystem of decision and execution. The Germans, accustomed to winning with centralized engineering, now faced distributed engineering. And this was revealed at the end of the pipe. But it was born much earlier. What they didn't know is that the howitzers were just the beginning. Because the next Allied innovation wouldn't come from the pipe. It would come from sound, and it would reach the walls of Germany in the form of auditory trauma, invisible shrapnel, and mental breakdowns. Terror would begin to manifest itself before impact, and the silence between shots would become the real noise. Between June 1944 and April 1945, 240mm M1 howitzers fired 118,429 shells at strategic targets on European territory. Of these, more than 16,000 were directed exclusively to fixed Wehrmacht fortifications. The accuracy recorded in the Fire Direction Center's reports was devastating. 78% of the fortified targets were neutralized in as much as 50 shots. Under ideal conditions, the number dropped to 12. A reinforced concrete bunker, designed to withstand aviation bombing, lasted an average of 4 minutes after being identified. In the field, this meant that positions that took months to build were erased before the commander had time to order evacuation. German defensive engineering, which since the end of World War I had relied on thickness, depth, and segmentation, found itself hostage to a new parameter that it could not combat: American response time. German doctrine, based on structural rigidity and physical invulnerability, began to collapse. General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff of Army Group B, wrote in February 1945, "We are faced with a weapon that nullifies planning. No fortification can be designed against something that changes position every day and fires with absolute accuracy." The German language of the war was mathematical, and it was by mathematics that they were defeated. The M1's useful range exceeded 23,000 meters, allowing it to operate out of range of light artillery and most counterattacks. Its 360-pound projectile, when equipped with a delayed fuse, penetrated more than 180 meters of concrete before detonation, generating an internal shockwave capable of shattering support structures and throwing fragments at unpredictable angles. In several cases, Allied engineers reported internal craters collapsing upwards. A bunker imploded from the inside out. But what shook the Germans the most was not the visual effect. It was the repetition. It was not an isolated event. A mythical weapon like Gustav or Dora. The terror came from the statistics. By the end of the war, at least 847 fixed fortifications of the Siegfried Line had been directly hit by the 240mm Howitzers. Of these, 531 were considered unusable, 203 completely destroyed, and 114 literally erased from the map, with no possibility of reconstruction. Each issue was a monument to the failure of a doctrine. The fixed fortress, the subterranean stronghold, the reinforced steel shelter. Everything became vulnerable in the face of a weapon that operated with precision and rhythm. The most emblematic thing is that Germany itself had taught the world that war was won by planning. But now it was defeated by better planning. Interviews conducted by the U.S. military after the surrender revealed the psychological shock. Wehrmacht artillery and engineering officers went on to call the M1 a no-response weapon. A lieutenant in the 65th Corps reported, "There was no way to react. There was no engine noise, no visible infantry, just a precise explosion that ripped off the ceiling." In another interview, an officer from the 21st Panzer Division stated, "We tried to reinforce the structures with additional layers of concrete, but they cracked all the same. With each reinforcement, a new shot came, and the hole got bigger." General Alfred Schlemm himself, in his diary of March 1945, recorded, "The worst thing is not the damage. It's the fact that we know the damage will come. It doesn't matter how deep we are." The German front line, which had previously confidently sheltered inside the bunkers, began to abandon them. In February 1945, internal Wehrmacht circulars warned of a fall in the discipline of occupying fortifications, a sign that soldiers, on their own, preferred to sleep in open trenches rather than spend the night under concrete. It was the psychological collapse of a structure that depended on trust in the shelter. The impact spread not only on targets but on morale. A bunker that offers no protection is just an elaborate trap, and the soldiers knew it. The U.S. Army, aware of the effect, began to exploit indirect terror. In several offensives, it was enough to announce the presence of M1 howitzers in the region to cause premature displacements, surrenders, and abandonment of positions. The threat had become a strategic factor, fortitude, an illusion, and the shelter, a risk. But even in the face of this data, a final test was still missing, a supreme proof that no Reich building was safe. An underground complex protected by layers of rock, concrete, and steel, the fortress Hitler never imagined he would see crumble. She was hiding in the hills of Western Germany, and his name was Metz. At the heart of every 240mm shot was more than metal and gunpowder. There was human coordination, sweat, and precision. Around each M1 howitzer, 14 men formed a living, synchronized gear, where every gesture counted. The crane rotated slowly, positioning the 5-meter barrel with a margin of error of less than 2 millimeters. Operators cleaned the grooves, checked the chamber, calibrated the elevation with heavy cranks. A miscalculation didn't just cost ammunition, it cost lives. Technical Sergeant Frank Delaney of the 983rd Artillery Battalion wrote in a letter to his wife, "I have never seen a sound make a man's eyes tremble until the day we fired the first 240. It wasn't a blast. It was a roar that ran through you from the inside." The routines were exhausting. With each shot, the 1.5-meter rewind required a new recalibration. The ammunition crew carried the projectile on steel stretchers, weighing more than one man. Each piece was loaded with a specific primer, impact, delayed, or timed, defined by the type of target. There was no room for doubt. The slightest mistake meant wasted shot or insufficient destruction. On the field, the weather was relentless. The forward observer timed the corrections with the SCR 610 radio. The FDC confirmed the coordinates. The position was repositioned between shots. And throughout the process, the tension was constant. In a letter filed by the War Department, Private Clarence Boyd described, "We knew they were hunting us with mortars. Working with the M1 was like operating a beast blindfolded. It roared, but it also left us exposed. The sound of it called for enemy fire. The cruel irony was that the howitzer, so advanced, depended on muscles, calluses, and reflexes. Each replacement part required manual installation. The deployment required coordination with cranes and M2 trailers, often in fog, rain, and air raids. And even so, the system worked. The discipline of the operators turned complexity into routine. On average, each team could assemble the full howitzer in 6 hours, even under fire. This meant that an M1 howitzer could fire in an afternoon more than a German railway supercannon fired in a week. The difference wasn't just in range or caliber, it was in constancy. In February 1945, the 983rd Battalion recorded 1,049 rounds in 13 days. No critical errors, no mechanical breakdown. This is because American logistics produced more than 2,240mm shells per week. Now a pause. The Germans, throughout the war, produced about 14,280mm railway shells. The Americans exceeded that number by just over 2 months, with a handgun. If this comparison surprised you, comment with, "Logistics wins," because it was this invisible force, based on continuous production, rigorous training, and human coordination, that really turned the tide. And the most remarkable thing was that these operators, who often did not see the target, carried the psychological weight of the impact. Many only learned what they had destroyed weeks later. In post-war interviews, some expressed regret when they learned that certain shots had collapsed full shelters. Others admitted to recurring nightmares about the sound of the explosion. One operator reported, "When I heard the fire command, I felt proud. After the impact, I could only hear the silence." This is the forgotten part of the machine. It wasn't just steel, it was meat. And it was men like these who, in March 1945, positioned their howitzers in front of Metz, the fortress with medieval walls, reinforced pillboxes, and trenches designed to hold out for months. What would follow would be the battle that would redefine the concept of fixed defense, because not even 1,000 years of military architecture would withstand the millimetric calculation of the M1, and the Germans were about to find out, the hard way. October 1944. In one of the reports of the Wehrmacht's 276th Regiment, a company commander writes with disquiet, "Our men refused to stay in the fortifications during the night. They asked to sleep in the trenches. They say, it's safer." This was the new reality that spread across the fronts of Italy, Normandy, and the Gothic Line. It was no longer just a matter of fighting the Allied advance, but of avoiding dying buried by it. Fortifications that for years represented protection, superiority, and dominance of the terrain came to be seen as concrete tombs. The enemy no longer needed to surround or invade. All you had to do was find them, calculate, and shoot. And when the M1 howitzer spoke, no engineer could save them. German soldiers who survived the first waves of impact reported the same phenomenon. The bunker shook from the inside. The pressure ruptured eardrums. Fragments of the wall broke off the ceiling like rain. There was no alarm. There was no combat. Only the low sound of the impact and, seconds later, the echo of the collapse. At Monte Battaglia, Italy, a position designed to hold out for 14 days was abandoned in less than 9 hours, and most tellingly without a single Allied infantry attack. Only artillery. The fear that grew among the Germans was no longer of invasion. It was of waiting. The doctrine that relied on Festung, the concept of fortress cities, was disintegrating along with the pillars that supported it. Fortification ceased to be an advantage and became a sentence. The officers knew this. In documents captured by the Americans, orders are highlighted calling for soldiers to be required to remain within the structures, and punished if they abandoned positions before the order to withdraw. The war against concrete itself had begun, because what once symbolized invulnerability now suggested trapping. At Col Belvedere, Allied observers noticed something curious: an intact but completely empty bunker. Inside, a diary left behind contained only 4 words. They know where to aim. The certainty that the enemy possessed some kind of supernatural vision began to circulate among the German troops. In fact, it was not supernatural. It was just doctrine applied with excellence. The precision of the 240mm added to the speed of communication and the ability to reposition made any static structure obsolete. And the soldiers knew that if they were seen, they would be shot at, and if they were in a fixed position, they would be destroyed. In Normandy, at Omaha, and Utah Beach, machine gun bunkers were priority targets. But the pattern repeated itself. Even before the complete landing, several had been abandoned, their accesses blocked from the inside, ammunition left behind. In the post-war period, military archaeologists found open bottles of brandy, unfinished letters and religious symbols left on makeshift altars at many of these sites. These were not gestures of resistance, right? They were prayers of those who knew they would be buried. The strategic turn was brutal. The power had changed form. It was no longer enough to have concrete. It was necessary to have mobility, adaptability, dispersion, three factors that the German doctrine until that moment did not value. And the greatest symbol of this failure was about to collapse. Metz, a fortress city with Roman roots modernized by the French, occupied by the Germans and transformed into a stronghold of the Reich. 40 pillboxes, armored tunnels, underground artillery. Hitler had declared, "Metz will not fall. It is a wall of steel." But the wall in practice was made of layers, and what the Americans carried now were projectiles designed exactly to go through layers. When the first shots were fired at Metz, there was no response. The defenders expected encirclement, not precision, and in the weeks since, the most common reports have been the same: structures disappearing, shelters collapsing, morale dissolving. Colonel Heinrich Berg, commander of a sector of the fortress, reported in code, "We could no longer hold the men. They are terrified. The bunker became a trap, and the Americans have infinite ammo." Ammunition, production, logistics, and doctrine. The combination that turned German defensive engineering into statistical ruin. And the cruelest was yet to come, because the next fortification was not just military, it was symbolic. A line of concrete, towers, mines, and national ego. A fortification that Hitler called an impassable barrier. But in front of the 240mm, the Siegfried Line was about to become a crater field. While the Germans prided themselves on their gigantic guns, railroad monsters like the 80cm Gustav, which required 2,000 men to assemble and days for each shot, on the other side of the Atlantic, the American machine operated in silence and scale. The Watervliet Arsenal in New York State produced the 240mm M1 Howitzers at an industrial pace, not to impress audiences, but to win wars. Every 29 hours, a new pipe was finished. Each unit went through 314 manufacturing steps, involving heavy forging, precision machining, and heat treatments in industrial ovens up to 200-degree low. More than 3,800 workers operated in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, without interruption, a model that the Germans were never able to replicate. The secret was not only technical, it was doctrinal. While Berlin centralized resources on experimental weapons, the United States standardized processes, decentralized assembly, and optimized logistics routes. On the Watervliet assembly line, more than 40% of the workforce was made up of women. Many of them operated precision lathes with micrometer tolerances, producing components that would be fired more than 20 kilometers away. Modern warfare required more than strength. It required constancy. And the Americans had discovered that the real power lay not in a supercannon, but in hundreds of howitzers that worked with statistical reliability. With each shipment of parts, munitions factories in Indiana, Illinois, and Pennsylvania followed with synchronized supplies: hulls, propellants, fuses, and electrical components. Nothing was improvised. Everything was predictable, scalable, replaceable. A howitzer that suffered damage had another in its place in less than 72 hours. German railway guns, despite the visual impact, fired less than 50 times during the entire war. Each of them consumed logistical resources equivalent to an entire battalion, and they became a priority target for Allied aviation. Germany produced 6 units of the Gustav. The U.S. in return delivered 315 units of the M1 240mm, each with an assembly manual, trained staff, and tactical integration. No single weapon has won the war. What won was continuous production, rational doctrine, replicable engineering. The German generals did not understand how the Americans managed to maintain so much firepower, even after months of offensive, in part because they were stuck with the idea that technology was synonymous with complexity. But in Watervliet, the logic was different. Technology was that which could be repeated, and this the U.S. knew how to do better than any other nation. By 1945, as the Germans struggled to keep a single production line running, the United States operated more than 800 heavy armaments factories. Of these, 73 produced exclusively heavy artillery ammunition. The Allied arsenal wasn't just bigger, it was uninterrupted. Every 3 shots from an M1, another projectile was already in rail transit to the front. The supply line functioned as an organism. Each battalion had mobile stockpiles, maintenance workshops, and direct access to the logistics echelon. While the German howitzers were unique pieces in specific fields, the M1s were in constant rotation. They fired, dismounted, moved, fired again. When one was destroyed at Bastogne, another took its position within 9 hours. American engineers called this continuous fire mobility. The Germans, in their diaries, called it a repetitive miracle, but it was not a miracle. It was method. A method that saw the battlefield as a spreadsheet of deadlines, weights, numbers, and precision. And behind every number there was a factory, an assembly line, a woman operating a lathe, an overnight train crossing Kansas, a logistic train arriving in Normandy. The M1 howitzer was not a piece of steel. It was the final manifestation of an industrial network that did not stop. And the Germans, realizing this, understood that they were fighting something bigger than armies. They were fighting against a country that had put its industrial intelligence at the service of systematic destruction. Still, even with all this, there was a fortress that still resisted, an entire line of defense which stretched for 630 kilometers, the last wall of the Reich, and the howitzers were ready, because the next victim of American industrial doctrine would be the Siegfried Line, and the impact wouldn't just be physical, it would be moral. For decades, German military doctrine was built on a tripod of precision, planning, and fortification. From the Prussian treaties to the Reichswehr reforms, defensive engineering was considered a science. The lines of pillboxes, the crossfire systems, the layers of reinforced concrete, all reflected an unshakable belief that the fixed, well-constructed position was the key to resisting enemy advance. The Siegfried Line was the culmination of this belief. Stretching for more than 630 kilometers, with 18,000 bunkers, anti-tank moats, and interconnected positions, it was conceived as the final shield of the Reich. But in 1944, this shield found something that Prussian doctrine had never predicted: mobile artillery with surgical precision and American industrial logistics. The 240mm Howitzers arrived at the Siegfriedo Line with a simple and devastating purpose: not to conquer, but to dismantle. Operations began in September, with aerial reconnaissance and target marking. In a few days, dozens of fortifications were mapped, coordinates transmitted, pieces assembled. The first impact happened on September 13th. A bunker with 2.5-meter thick walls collapsed after 3 shots. What was supposed to be a position of containment became the first example of doctrinal bankruptcy. The attack was now more precise than the defense. General Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Operations for Army Group B, wrote in his report, "The positions are becoming traps. Each fortification destroyed causes panic in 3 adjacent sectors. Commanders began issuing preemptive evacuation orders. Engineers couldn't repair the damage between shots. The doctrine of fixed resistance was collapsing. And the irony was brutal. The Germans, who had defined the concept of scientific warfare, were now being defeated by calculations made by young American lieutenants with rulers, radium, and a good topographical map. The fire operations involved multiple pieces firing in convergence. The effect was that of invisible hammers crushing the same point from multiple directions. When a casemate did not give way on first impact, the type of fuse was changed. The angle was recalibrated. The time was adjusted. It was the mathematics of destruction, applied with factory discipline. General Blumentritt, upon being captured, stated in interrogation, "The first time I saw a bunker disappear without even an infantry attack, I understood that we had lost. It was no longer a matter of bravery. It was physics." On the field, the impression was that the Americans had vision beyond the concrete. Each day, new targets were consistently erased. Some German units began sabotaging their own shelters before the enemy arrived. They would rather destroy than die in prisoners. The Siegfriedo Line, idealized as an eternal wall, was being eaten by the edges like paper in front of fire. Allied tactical maps began to mark the areas with a new symbology: destroyed by 240mm, and there were not a few. In November 1944, a report by the 1st Infantry Division indicated that more than 30% of the fortifications on the eastern front of the line were unusable even before any direct engagement. Not by mines, tanks, or bombers, but by howitzers towed by trucks. Prussian doctrine had underestimated modern field artillery. He trusted the thickness of the concrete, ignoring that concrete does not resist a well-executed equation, and the greatest symbol of this bankruptcy was about to fall. A fortified complex with 4 underground levels, armored generators and stocks to last 40 days. He was hit 19 times in less than 2 hours, and after the 20th shot, it disappeared from the ground as if it had never existed. The American tactic was clear: break the line without entering it. Trench warfare, expected by the Germans, never came. Instead, numbers, logarithms, penetration charts, and serial ammunition came. What was left to the German command was resignation, and the final sentence recorded in Colonel Ludwig Reimer's diary, highlighted on the wall of the Artillery Museum at Fort Sill, sums up the end of the fixed doctrine. They do not encircle, they do not invade, they simply disappear with what we have built. But there was still one place where the Reich placed its last confidence: a mountainous sector covered by dense forest, with positions that Hitler believed impregnable. His name was Hürtgen, and it was there that American precision would find its most brutal proof. When the smoke cleared and the impact ceased, what was left was not just rubble, it was silence. Heavy, dense, almost unbearable. The silence of men who had survived the unthinkable. In the decades following the end of the war, German and American military psychologists began to notice a pattern among former Wehrmacht soldiers who had served in fixed positions. Recurring nightmares, fear of enclosed spaces, panic attacks when hearing thunder or high-pitched metallic sounds. Medicine called it post-traumatic claustrophobia, but in the Bonn psychiatric archives, an unofficial name began to circulate: the bunker syndrome. It was the emotional collapse of those who saw, heard, and survived a shelter that collapsed on them. Between 1952 and 1964, 36% of veterans who served in Siegfried Line fortifications reported severe symptoms of phonophobia, a dread of loud noises. More than half developed some degree of chronic insomnia. Most of them had episodes of disorientation when they found themselves in windowless environments. The cruel irony is that the shelter, which it was supposed to protect, became the very trigger of trauma. Doctors identified that the trauma was aggravated by the symbolic factor. The bunker was, for the German soldier, more than a military structure. It was a psychological refuge, and when it collapsed, it didn't just take concrete, it took the idea of safety. The 240mm Howitzer, when it reached its target, left no survivors in the classic sense. It left men broken, emotionally mutilated. Psychiatrist Helmut Schneider, a post-war veteran and researcher, stated in 1959, "Our soldiers were not overcome by death, but by the terror of waiting. The bunker became a prison. The sound of the explosion. Sentence." In a clinical session, a former officer cried as he described the moment he heard the first impacts in Metz. It was as if the ground itself had betrayed us. The feeling of being safe had been reversed. Psychologically, the shelter came to be interpreted as a trap. And the repetition of this experience created an unprecedented kind of moral collapse in stationary troops. Let's pause here for a specific fact. Between 1944 and 1945, of the 847 bunkers hit by 240mm howitzers, 114 were completely destroyed with a single impact. These were, according to the German engineers, indestructible structures. If this statistic seems unbelievable, comment, "Shocking data," because the real impact of this war was not only physical, it was neurological. The Americans had created, perhaps unknowingly, the first precision weapon capable of disintegrating not only targets, but beliefs. The sound of the impact, dry, low, unmistakable, became an emotional trigger. There are records of veterans who, years later, when they heard tire bursts, fainted or went into a state of confusion. The trauma was so systematic that West German medical authorities had to create exclusive compensation categories for soldiers who had served in fixed positions under heavy artillery. In rehabilitation centers, psychologists used models of bunkers to try to desensitize patients, in many cases without success. The pain was symbolic, and that's exactly what made the 240mm Howitzer so lethal, because he wasn't just a weapon, it was a verdict. The German soldiers who had been trained to rely on their defenses were faced with something they could not comprehend. American ammunition did not come in the thousands, like indiscriminate bombing. It came alone, specific, calculated, and he was right. This created an atmosphere of psychological terror that, according to post-war accounts, eroded resistance even before the first shot. Lieutenant Dieter Klaus, in interrogation after the surrender, said, "We preferred to fight tanks. With them we could at least react. But these shots? We didn't know where they came from or when. We just knew they were coming." War at this point was no longer about positions. It was one of perceptions, and the Americans were winning because they had reversed the roles. The German shelter had become a trap. The American attack, anticipation. Precision didn't just destroy structures, it destroyed the logic that justified them. When a shelter was hit, everyone else around it became suspicious. It was as if the entire land had lost its meaning, and this loss of meaning echoed beyond the front lines. In the internal Wehrmacht newspapers, calls began to appear to modify the doctrines of fixed defense. In March 1945, an internal circular recommended the voluntary withdrawal of fixed positions considered psychologically unstable. Never before in military history had a weapon imposed not only physical defeat, but institutional trauma, and Americans knew that this side effect was, in fact, a multiplier effect, because the next offensive would come just where German morale could no longer sustain even the concrete, and the shells were already on their way to the Ardennes. In December 1944, in the days leading up to the German offensive in the Ardennes, the mood among the Reich troops was not one of hope. It was one of foreboding. The enemy was no longer visible. He did not march in ranks. He did not shout orders. He came in silence, calculated, and struck, and when it did, it left no chance of redemption. The presence of the 240mm Howitzers in the Allied lines had established a new type of war, a war where the moment of combat is not chosen, only the sentence is awaited. Major Günther Brendel of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, captured days after the Battle of the Bulge, coolly summed it up. "We fought expecting to hear the impact, not expecting to see the enemy." The concept of inevitability became part of the German soldiers' emotional doctrine. It was no longer a question of resisting. It was a question of not being next. Trench warfare, where courage and leadership would define the outcome, gave way to a war of probabilities. The shelter did not protect. The attack was not preventable. The front line was an illusion. The real enemy was in a radio, in a calculation, in a ballistic table made miles away. The war had become an equation. For many officers, this change was more than strategic. It was spiritual. Accounts of interrogations carried out by American units reveal soldiers who referred to the sound as an entity. A sergeant of the 277th Infantry Division even said, "We knew that when the sound came, it was the end. No one escaped. Not even prayer helped." In his diary, found after the surrender, there is a note repeated 7 times. "When they hear the roar, it will be too late." The roar was the sound signature of the 240mm Howitzer, a dry, severe thunder that cut through the air and seconds later turned concrete into dust. This noise became a symbol of a new type of power, impersonal, remote, technical power. The decision of who lived or died was made by an artillery officer with a map in hand, and that, for the Germans, was disconcerting. There was no duel. There was no honor, only execution. On the field, this perception generated paralysis. Entire troops were hesitant to deploy to fortified structures, preferring open areas, even without cover, just to avoid the surgical blow. It was a dilemma with no way out. Stay in the bunker and be crushed, or get out and die in the open. Traditional doctrine offered no answers, and fear infiltrated even the most experienced. Colonel Alfred Becker, a veteran of the Eastern Front, stated when questioned, "What the Russians could not do with brutality, the Americans did logically." Every shot was a verdict. The fatalism wasn't just psychological, it was tactical. Commanders began to organize mobile resistance battalions, preventing any attempt at a continuous line. The idea of a permanent defensive position was abandoned in several Wehrmacht divisions without official warning. Simply, no one trusted fixed structures anymore. And that, in essence, was the American victory before the fight. Because when the enemy leaves the ground in anticipation, the battle has already been won, not with blood, but with dice. Inevitability became an alternative doctrine. In the impromptu religious preaching on the fronts, German chaplains began to avoid speeches about victory or resistance. They began to speak of resignation, duty, and destiny. The soldier was no longer a combatant. He was a witness. And destiny now came on wheels, towed by trucks, pointed by radios, fired by coordinates. The war had changed form, and this new format did not accept improvisation. The Americans had replaced heroism with the system, and the system did not fail. In an intercepted letter from an officer of the German 212th Division, one sentence sums up what many did not dare to say. With each new shot from them, I have the feeling that the future is already decided. Because it was. The American calculation included margins of error, replenishment routes, recharge cycles. German included faith, obstinacy, and hope, and none of these variables stood up to the math of impact. But the greatest irony was yet to come, because while the Germans watched their bunkers turn into traps and their doctrines collapse like fractured concrete, the Americans were preparing something even bolder, integrating the 240mm Howitzers into the fast-advancing offensives. The artillery that demolished fortresses was about to become a weapon of rupture. And the field chosen for this transformation? A former bastion of the Reich armored forces, a place where, in the past, tanks had been sovereign. But now, the one who decided the victory was the one who shot farther, faster, with more precision. And heavy artillery was about to be redesigned as an instrument of speed. While the Soviet fronts advanced with steel storms, massive artillery barrages that swept miles in a straight line, and the British followed more classical methods of saturation by sectors, the Americans did something that few understood at the time. They treated each bunker as a unique equation. There was no random saturation. There was calculation. Accuracy has become more important than volume. And behind each 240mm shot, there was an almost clinical process of measuring, correcting, and verifying. The American doctrine was called fire for effect, and not for intimidation. At the center of this process were the Fire Direction Centers, FDCs, veritable operational brains of the artillery. There, topographic maps, ballistic tables, weather reports, and information from advanced observers were cross-referenced with mathematical discipline. Artillery was no longer just brute force. It began to operate as an extension of engineering. The process followed an unalterable logic: visual identification, triangulation, shot adjustment, correction, impact. Each bunker ceased to be a generic target and became a geometric problem. Height of the terrain, wind direction, type of soil, density of the concrete, everything entered the equation. The constantly updated indirect shot M18 boards allowed even minute variations in temperature and pressure to be incorporated into the shot. A miscalculation of 0.2 thousandths of an inch in the elevation adjustment could mean a failed impact, but the Americans were not wrong. On the contrary, they tuned it. The average number of shots needed to eliminate a bunker dropped from 50 in Anzio to 38 on the Siegfried Line and reached 27 on the outskirts of Saarbrücken. It was the pinnacle of the precision doctrine, and while the Soviets destroyed entire forests to neutralize a position, the Americans erased specific targets without altering the surrounding topography. A German observer in Metz reported, "The land next door was intact, but the bunker, it just disappeared." The psychological effect of this was devastating. The enemy seemed omniscient. There was no safe cover, no familiar ground. A small mistake, lighting a cigarette, opening a hatch, using an unencrypted radio, was enough for a shot to come minutes later as a response. The sound of the impact was not accompanied by a warning. There was no prelude, no opening volleys. It was direct, dry, definitive, and it was always at the exact point. The geometry of chaos was not based on chance, but on predictability. Where the enemy was, where he would move, where he thought he was safe, that was where the impact would come. And this marked the distinction between the doctrines. The British relied on the doctrine of drum fire, continuous fire of saturation. The Soviets in numerical superiority and uninterrupted volume. The Americans, on the other hand, opted for the equation. Artillery was the arm of reason. a ratio calculated under pressure with defined targets, with measurable objectives. And each bunker destroyed was the successful resolution of a problem. Captain James Elridge, battery commander at Nancy, stated in an interview, "I didn't fire a howitzer. I was solving a problem. The impact was just the confirmation that the account was right." This philosophy transformed the perception of power. It was no longer the one who shouted the loudest, it was the one who solved it the fastest. And the Americans had, in addition to precision, scale. Between July 1944 and March 1945, more than 24,000 rounds of 240mm were recorded in fortified sectors alone. Of these, more than 70% reached the planned lethal impact radius. Pause here, 70%. A rate that, even by modern standards, is considered high. If this number is surprising, comment, "Logistics wins." Because this victory was not improvised. It was written in pencil on drawing boards, traced by technicians, proofread by engineers, and fired by soldiers who understood that each bunker was not just an enemy, it was an enigma. And while the Germans desperately sought how to strengthen their fixed points, the Americans advanced bunker by bunker as if flipping through the pages of a technical manual. What seemed like an attack turned into a lawsuit. What seemed like chaos was actually a ritual of exactitude. And the war was won by those who had more engineers than generals. But there was one place where the calculations would be pushed to the limit. A point on the map where accuracy would be tested against the most complex of fortified labyrinths. A field where the concrete was deep, the terrain uneven, and the German defense fanatical. It was the last bastion before the Rhine. And there, the mathematics of war would have its final equation. In March 1945, as the Allied columns advanced along the broken roads of Germany, there was a town where time seemed to have frozen. Aschaffenburg, nestled on the banks of the River Main, carried an architecture that dated back to the 13th century. It was as if the stone itself declared resistance, and that was why the local German command decided there would be no retreat there. Aschaffenburg would become a symbol. The Nazis reinforced accesses, turned churches into observation posts, created firing corridors between alleys, and stationed anti-tank batteries inside schools, all to try to stop the inevitable advance. For 7 days, conventional fire was not enough. American troops faced a city armed like a castle. Light artillery failed to break through the walls, and the urban assault promised a high human cost. But then, on March 28th, the batteries of the 991st Heavy Artillery Battalion arrived. Towed by M1 trucks, the 240mm Howitzers positioned themselves on the outskirts of the city. In silence, they began to assemble their equations. The first shot hit a school converted into a communications center. The second, a 16th century building that served as a German observation point. In less than 3 hours, 4 of the main defense points were reduced to craters. The city trembled, and with it, the will to resist. Major Emil Lamberts, commander of the square, reported on his surrender. "We had nowhere else to be. With each impact, the city fell apart. Johannesburg Castle, a local symbol, lost one of its towers. The city hall was decapitated by a direct hit. Civilians in shelters reported that the sound seemed to come from underground, as if the entire earth was being dug from the inside. The 240mm howitzer didn't just go through walls. It disintegrated structures thought to last for centuries. A specific shot at 2:03 p.m. hit a defensive intersection protected by 5 meters of reinforced concrete. The explosion didn't just open a crater, it caused the defenders to abandon the entire sector. A local woman, Maria Heitzmann, would write years later, "It was as if the sky had spat out a sentence. The defense collapsed, and what was once a symbol of firmness has become a labyrinth of rubble. In 24 hours, Aschaffenburg ceased to be a fortress and became a ruin." The surrender came not out of exhaustion but out of uselessness. There was nowhere else to position troops. There was nowhere else to hide. Not even the past, made of stone and tradition, survived. Because the precision of American calculations did not spare architectural style. It was functional, lethal, and immune to nostalgia. With each impact, it wasn't just a wall that came down, it was an era that ended. The irony of this story is that the solution was always there, visible, logical. The Germans had bet on the eternal. The Americans invested in the effective. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts with the depth they require, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content like this. Because while the bunkers disappeared under explosions, a new kind of war took hold. A war in which historical memory was no longer a refuge, but an obstacle. In Aschaffenburg, the sound of howitzers has silenced for centuries. But soon that same sound would be heard at the gates of the capital. And there, not even Nazi propaganda would resist the equation. While the spotlight of history illuminated generals and battles, there was a silent force operating in the shadows. A force without which no 240mm shot would have crossed the skies of Europe. It was made up of men and women who had never set foot on the battlefield, but who, in precise and repetitive ways, shaped the fate of the war with their own hands. In the workshops of the Watervliet Arsenal in New York, the constant sound of the lathes was almost an echo of the distant front. There, Margaret Lane, a 24-year-old factory worker, manually adjusted the internal threads of the barrels of 240mm howitzers. She knew that an error of half a millimeter could compromise the shot, and for this reason his every move was made with absolute concentration. "I don't make guns," she once said. "I make my way home." And she was not alone. For a single shot to happen, dozens of functions had to line up. The driver who went through the mud with the ammunition, the crane operator who hoisted the 150 kilos warhead with millimeter precision, the technician who lubricated the recoil system with special anti-fragmentation grease, the soldier who timed the detonation time with a screwdriver and nerves of steel. None of them made headlines, but they were all part of the machine. In the field, each howitzer garrison operated as an organism. 14 men, each with a task, and no mistakes allowed. One false move, a miscommunication, and the shot could fail, or worse, explode inside the barrel. It was war taken to the limit of synchrony. Private Joseph "Red" Halverson, a cargo operator with the 5th Heavy Artillery Division, wrote to his wife, "We are not combatants. We are watchmakers. But if we make a mistake, time stops." In refueling, the front line relied on motorists who traveled bombed-out roads for days at a time, often without an escort. One of them, African-American Elijah Barnes, recorded in a diary, "The noise of the truck never stops. It's as if the engine were part of the heart of the war." Elijah drove more than 200 tons of ammunition for the 240mm howitzers between November 1944 and March 1945. He never fired a gun, but each accurate shot had his hand behind him. In factories, women like Margaret used optical calibrators to inspect the internal alignment of pipes. Some spent 12 hours a day looking at steel, looking for micro cracks invisible to the naked eye. If they found one, the pipe was rejected, because it wasn't just a play, it was the difference between life and death. Behind the scenes of the artillery, there was also the silence of the technician, who adjusted the SCR 610 radios, ensuring that the forward observer could transmit clearly. The code was simple, the channel limited, the time short, and even then, coordination flowed. Because for every man who saw the target through the periscope, there was another making sure the lens was clean, the radio calibrated, the map correct. It was a network of invisible effort, sustained by precision and faith in the other. None of these names were mentioned in speeches. None entered the books as a hero. But without them, the howitzer was just dead weight, and victory, an incomplete equation. The strength of those who do not appear was in constancy, in the gesture repeated thousands of times with discipline, in the absence of glory, and in the presence of responsibility. Private John R. Mullins of Battery E of the 991st Battalion described in a letter, "We loaded, cleaned, adjusted. We do this every night not knowing where we are going to hit, but we know it will hit." And this certainty was the result of a human chain that began long before the field. American logistics wasn't just efficient, it was moral. Every piece inspected, every ammunition counted, every planned route carried a common purpose, to make the gear turn without fail, because they knew that on the other side of the ocean, there was a soldier waiting for everything to work. And it worked. With each bunker destroyed, there was the silent signature of thousands. With each accurate shot, a chain of invisible decisions. If there is a lesson in this story, it is that the force is not only on the front, it is born behind the scenes. And the real heroes often wear jumpsuits, hold tools, and disappear into the anonymity of the production. What the Germans called impossible was carried out by workers, mechanics, porters, cooks, for the crowd that doesn't show up. But that sustains everything, and it is with them that the next chapter begins. Because when the 240mm reached the last barrier before Berlin, it carried much more than explosive. He carried the weight of all those who made the impossible routine. While the Americans adjusted their ballistic equations and perfected the art of turning fortifications into rubble, the German high command dug trenches with its gaze fixed on the past. For Adolf Hitler and his leadership, the fortress was more than a structure. It was a dogma. From the first days of the war, the Führer had nurtured an obsession to create insurmountable barriers, symbolic and physical walls that separated the Reich from defeat. That vision crystallized into 3 concrete monuments: the Maginot Line, which he inspired, the Siegfried Line, which he rebuilt, and the Atlantic Wall, which he dreamed impenetrably. But while German engineers poured cement and steel into fixed positions, Americans refined the motion. German defensive doctrine ignored the changing battlefield, and he would pay dearly for it. After Anzio, Wehrmacht reports warned, the new Allied shells were penetrating 6 feet of concrete. At Monte Cassino, 4 fortifications were destroyed by indirect fire, fired from beyond visual range, and in Normandy, 11 bunkers of the Atlantic Wall were extinguished before landing, with field artillery alone. The pattern was clear, but Hitler did not back down. For him, to retreat was to betray the idea of the fortress. When General Alfred Jodl suggested a reassessment of the fixed positions, Hitler retorted, "The concrete does not fail. It is men who fail." This phrase echoed in the corridors of the Führer bunker until the last days. Ignoring reality has become official policy. While the Allies invested in mobility, intelligence, and precision artillery, Berlin doubled down on structures that were already outdated. In the spring of 1945, even with the Eastern Front collapsing, the order was to reinforce pillboxes south of Berlin. With cement missing from bridges, it was used on bunker walls. Civil engineer Ernst Kempke, who was responsible for part of the fortifications in East Prussia, wrote in March, "We keep building tombs, but no one seems to notice." There was a doctrinal blindness. Faith in the solidity of concrete was so strong that it replaced logic. On the Siegfried Line, dozens of fortified positions were out of range of supplies, and yet they were ordered to hold their position until the end. At Trier, a group of engineers tried to warn that the Americans were using 240mm Howitzers with radio-corrected trajectory. The memorandum was shelved, and when the first impacts arrived, the shelter was the first to give way. What the Germans didn't understand, or refused to understand, is that they were fighting trench warfare against equations. American superiority lay not only in the quantity of steel, but in the ability to adjust doctrine on the fly. Each attack taught something new, and the lessons learned were applied in the next city, in the next shot. Meanwhile, the Germans dug deeper, built thicker, hoping that the past would be enough to protect the present. At an emergency meeting in February 1945, General Hans Krebs warned, "We are building monuments, not defenses." But it was too late. Belief was greater than reason. The mistake was not technical, it was ideological. And in the end, the Reich was surrounded by walls. But the walls no longer protected. They only delayed the inevitable. And the inevitable was approaching on wheels, cables, and maps, with the precision of a 240mm howitzer, which respected no history, no faith, no concreteness. And in the last great bunker of the Reich, beneath Berlin, a question began to echo among the surrounded generals. What to do when not even the ground is safer? Because the next shot, the shelter would cease to be protection, and would become a sentence. At dawn on March 23, 1945, the sky over Wessel, on the east bank of the Rhine, remained dark longer than expected. There were no sirens. There were no planes. There was only silence. And then, a vibration that grew underground. The American forward observers were already positioned, their radios calibrated, their coordinates fixed on millimeter maps. At 01:45 a.m., the first 240mm howitzer was fired, not against a moving enemy column, not against troops in the open, but against concrete, the matter that for 6 years had been a symbol of security. When the impact hit the first point of resistance north of the city, the ground shook for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that ended 6 years of German faith in the invulnerability of fortifications. In less than 4 hours, 29 fortified positions had been hit. Not all destroyed, but all abandoned. Because what arrived with those howitzers was not just steel, it was certainty. Certainty that there would be no margin for error. Sure that the attack would come even without a look. Certainty that the time of resistance was over. Colonel Hans-Jürgen Schmidt, commander of the defense of Wesel, surrendered before sunrise. When asked why he did not wait for the infantry to advance, he replied, "They would not come. They didn't need to. It was enough to listen." Around the city, other resistance centers did the same. The dull sound of gunfire was no longer interpreted as a threat. It was treated as a sentence. Soldiers tore up maps, hid flags, and walked with their hands raised before impact. The presence of the 240mm howitzer turned battles into evacuations. And the front was no longer geographical, it was psychological. At the crossing of the Rhine, American engineers opened 10 passages in 12 hours, none under direct fire, because there was no more German fire, just the memory of what he couldn't stop. General Omar Bradley recorded in a report, "Wesel did not fall. It disappeared." The crossing of the Rhine marked more than a territorial advance. It was the symbolic milestone of the final breakdown of German confidence. For the first time, the Americans found no fortifications to defend, but abandoned ruins. The sound of the howitzer no longer provoked reaction. It provoked surrender. And in that silence, the war accelerated. Because the sound that once heralded destruction now carried another meaning. The end was approaching, and it came from the horizon, with mathematical precision, surgical punctuality, and a roar that no bunker could silence. In the next impact, the war would cease to be combat, and would become a countdown. When the last 240mm howitzers fell silent, it was not just the sound of war that ceased. It was the definitive collapse of an ideology that believed it was possible to win the 20th century with 19th century logic. But by the ruthless combination of mathematics, steel, and mass production, Nazi Germany, which bet on individual genius and marvelous weapons, was buried by the cadence of an artillery sustained by factories that never slept, operated by civilians who never set foot on the front, but who, even so, redefined their contours. The empire of concrete collapsed before the empire of logistics. The great lesson of this campaign is not just in the maps or craters, it is in the principles it reaffirms. On the modern battlefield, superiority does not belong to those who have the bravest soldier, but to those who have the most adaptable system. It doesn't matter how thick the wall is if the enemy knows exactly where and when to hit. War is no longer decided at the moment of impact, but in the production spreadsheet, in the learning curve, in the doctrine that knows how to evolve before the enemy understands that he has lost. And it was General Wilhelm Burgdorf himself, an officer of the German High Command, who admitted, "We were defeated by factories, by radios, and by trucks." If you believe that stories like this deserve to be remembered with rigor and depth, support our work by leaving the like and subscribing to the channel. This allows us to continue digging up the data that reveals the true anatomy of war. And tell us in the comments, what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video? Don't forget to activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Because this story ends here, but the next one is ready to be told. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.